Bienvenidos a una nueva conversación con el Libero. En esta oportunidad vamos a hablar de temas que son muy profundos y que tienen que ver con el estado de nuestra civilización occidental. Algunas tendencias vamos a tocar, por supuesto, no podemos abordarlo todo, que amenazan nuestra calidad de vida o el tipo de vida que hemos conocido hasta ahora y que son muy relevantes en la realidad chilena y latinoamericana por distintos eventos que han ocurrido. Y para eso hemos invitado al filósofo Stephen Hicks, que es originario de Canadá y que es profesor de filosofía en Rockford College y que ha escrito muchos libros. Un libro muy interesante que yo leí hace un tiempo, me lo regaló Stephen, porque tuvimos la oportunidad de compartir en un evento en Argentina, uno que tiene que ver de la relación entre Nietzsche y los nazis, pero también ha escrito un libro muy importante sobre posmodernismo y que es un tema que vamos a tocar más en esta conversación, y ahora voy a hablar en inglés con nuestro anfitrión. Así es que, Stephen, welcome to El Libero, and thank you very much for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
Well, I'm happy and honored by the invitation, Axel.
So you have been worried for a long time, I think, about the state of mind, so to speak, of the West, and what's going on with our culture and our academic institutions, and the basic philosophy underlying our way of life. You wrote this book on postmodernism, which I read, and I thought it was really interesting. You have had, conversations with other great minds like our good friend Jordan Peterson, who is also worried about the same things. And I would like to start with a general, question. What's the main threat you think that we are facing right now as, culture in the West? And is there any chance that we can, be successful in fighting that? I guess the cancel culture concept, everyone knows that.
Sure.
But can you elaborate a little bit more on what it is and how you experience that in the developed world?
Well, I think what we're worried about most is just over the last 3 centuries, we've built up a magnificent civilization. I mean, you're an economist, so you know the numbers about how we've lifted over 90% of the world's population out of poverty, more than doubling life expectancy. And so economists have done a very good job, many of them, on understanding what has happened there. Obviously, behind a lot of that is liberal politics, freeing up people to participate in all walks of life, rather than keeping them not only in poverty, but in certain castes or classes with second or third class statuses. So all of that freeing has unleashed huge amounts of energy. But then also in the modern world, all of that is also underscored by incredible advancements in science, in engineering. So we talk about all of the scientific revolutions and the industrial revolutions and the engineering and so forth. So we are heirs to all of that, and we're living magnificent lives by human historical standards. So what I am most focusing on as a philosopher is the philosophy that made possible all of that. So we can talk about liberal economics, say, where we believe in free markets and open trade between countries. And underscoring all of that is a kind of a liberal insight that individuals should be free to run their own economic lives. I can decide to start my own business, to trade with whom I want. And we understand then that those markets are going to be very good at generating a lot of wealth. But underscoring that is that liberal idea, which is a kind of entrepreneurism, that each of us has to be the entrepreneur of our own life. And if we do that, since human beings are capable and can learn, we're going to unleash all sorts of wonderful economic results. And so that's a kind of liberal attitude with respect to entrepreneurship and the business. And we're doing the same thing with respect to democratic and republican politics. We're going to free individuals. Everyone is going to have liberty rights and to be able to participate in the process. And it's going to be a self-correcting process where people are going to think about the issues and have debates and then vote, and then they will learn from their mistakes, and then hopefully we will improve. And we've been extending that enormously around. Now, what's interesting is that same liberal mindset also underscores developments in science. Scientists first have to be free thinkers, to be willing to look at the evidence, to challenge the existing theories. They also have to have, of course, the political and the social freedom to be able to challenge more politically connected scientists than themselves, or people from outside of science who might want to stifle certain sorts of theories. But that idea that I'm going to think freely and creatively and experimentally, that liberal psychology is an achievement in the sciences, and that's also part of our inheritance. And then, of course, the same thing with all of the engineers who are very creative, that experimentalism, try this, we can improve that, and so on. So what I think most about is, of course, we talk about liberalism in the West, and that's now become more global, but it is underscored by a liberal philosophy, a way of thinking freely about the world. And we have made great success because we have encouraged and educated, and then it becomes self-reinforcing. The more wealth we create, the more we're then able to be more experimental, educate more people, give them the tools in order to create. So for me, as a philosopher, it's that issue of liberal psychology that underscores the science, the engineering, the politics, the economics. And that is where the greatest threat is. It's our greatest strength right now, but also is under attack by very well-entrenched, and in many cases, very sophisticated arguments that are sapping or undercutting people's willingness to engage in that creative free thinking. So cancel culture is one manifestation of that. And so that's a particular one that, as you point out, we're now all painfully aware for the last 6 or 7 years that there is this kind of festering problem that has suddenly popped up, where in what should be extraordinarily free cultures, the United States, Australia, Canada, and so on, and in universities with tenure and academic freedom and supposedly all this commitment to free thinking, we suddenly have this very articulate, entrenched group of people who are anti all of those things and are undercutting that liberal psychology.
So would you say that the distinctive characteristic of Western civilization is individualism, in the sense of the respect for the individual, individual rights, and this idea that we are free to pursue our happiness, as Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence? Is that something that you find in other civilizations? Is it individualism? Is it reason? Is it a combination of both? What do you think makes our civilization different from others?
Yeah, I think it's both of those, but I think individualism is both a value orientation. You are going to say the individual matters, right? You're not a serf, you're not a slave, you're not a peasant with all of these people further up. You as an individual, your life is yours and you should be able to live it freely in the pursuit of happiness. But that value individualism has to rest on a cognitive individualism. You have to first believe, and this is the reason point that you're talking about, you have to believe that individuals are competent to be able to live freely, that every human being has the capacity for thinking, for learning, for trial and error, experimenting, for being self-governing. Because if you don't think most people are smart enough to be able to think for themselves, then you're not going to say they should be free to pursue their own happiness, because you're going to think they're going to do stupid and wrong things with their freedom. Or you're not going to give them freedom in their economic lives, because then you're going to say they're just going to get taken advantage of by smarter people in the market, so they need to be protected. If you don't have that cognitive commitment to individual reason, you're not going to be any sort of Democrat or Republican. You're not going to say, let's give everybody a vote, because then you're going to think, well, if most people are too stupid,
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. They're going to vote for crazy, ridiculous things. So I think underlying the value individualism first is a cognitive individualism. And this was the revolution that was going on in the 1500s and on into the 1600s. And I think that's the real foundation. The value individualism comes quickly closer to that. So this is why, for example, I think someone like Galileo, and we know the story of Galileo's conflicts with the church, that really is over not a particular scientific theory, you know, that's the vehicle, but it's really over, are we going to say, and this is what Galileo was arguing, individuals have their senses, they have their reasoning, they can learn the math, we can all observe with these telescopes and so on, and that's how we should all figure out what the truth of the world is, versus a position that wants to say there is a cognitive elite that has a doctrine, and in more top-down authoritarian fashion, it's going to impose that doctrine. So it was the fact that Galileo and others, you know, Francis Bacon in England, Michel de Montaigne in France, Descartes in France, and a little bit later, John Locke, that commitment to cognitive individualism and the position that prevailed was that, yes, every human being that's born with normal faculties can learn to think. And so there's this then great wave of education. Every individual is going to learn how to read. We start to become richer. We reinvest in the education process, and it becomes an upwardly mobile modern society. So yes, it's the individualism, but that individualism has the two components, a cognitive component and a value component. Individuals are competent to run their own lives because they're smart potentially, and it's their life. And so we should respect their life, their right rather to live it the way they want to do. That's been the great inspiration for modern liberalism.
How do you explain then this, trends that you see in public debate in the US, also in Canada, and in many Western nations? You see intellectuals and famous people, broadcasters, whatever, claiming that the West is all about oppression and white supremacy, and that we were so evil, and that we have been basically civilization that's morally inferior even to any other, because there is no sense of proportion in their arguments. And
Right. Yep.
how do you explain this self-flagellation, this sort of we hate each other, we hate ourselves for what we are, and we are all racist, and we're all, how do you explain that?
Yeah, I don't think there is one answer to that, because that's a good phrase, the self-flagellation point, that these are internal to Western civilization. These are not external enemies coming in and attacking the West. It's an internally homegrown set of movements. And I don't think there's just one. I think there is one direction where there are individuals who will, for philosophical reasons, come to be skeptical and relativistic, nothing to do with politics or ideology. There has been in the 20th century a very skeptical wave of intelligent philosophers who were successful at mobilizing a new generation of skepticism, that our minds don't work, our senses are illusory, our conceptual categorizations are all just subjective, we just make up math and logic and so on. And so they convince themselves that reason is an incompetent subjectivist faculty. And on the basis of that, they then want to say, well, democracy and liberalism don't work, because democracy and liberalism is just going to be then an anarchistic free-for-all of all of these stupid people running around with all sorts of crazy ideas. And so on the basis of that, they won't believe in democratic institutions or Republican institutions, or that the free market can be a self-governing. So there's a whole school of people who just come out of a kind of skepticism about cognition. I think another approach, though, and I think this is the more important group right now, who do, I think, come out of it precisely for ideological reasons. As we got into the modern world, not everybody was on board with free markets and democratic republicanism and the idea of international trade and peace and equal rights and all of that. Instead, there was another modern ideology that developed that was already self-flagellating. And here I'm thinking about individuals like Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 1700s, and then on through individuals like Karl Marx and later figures on into the 20th century. And so what you have there is they're not committed to reason. They're not committed to individualism. They don't think that people should be free in that modern Western way that we think of stereotypically. Instead, they do think that people are irrational, they're more passion-driven, that they're constructed by forces beyond their control into adversarial groups, and that the strong then take advantage of the weak. And so that ideology, we can mention Rousseau's version, and then in the next century, Marx's version, also is very powerful. It was a minority current for much of European history and then American history, but it always was there and it was always strong. Now, what I think happened, particularly over the course of the 20th century, was that debate between the collectivists and the individualists, the capitalists and the socialists, and so on, that we are familiar with. By the time we got to the middle part of the 20th century, it was pretty clear to everyone that the collectivists had lost, right? That capitalism was superior to communism. Reason and science were superior in the way the Westerners were doing it to this top-down engineering approach, say in the Soviet Union. Or that if you tried to reorganize society without engineers and free markets, as the Chinese were trying to do, you just end up killing tens of millions of people. But what happened then by the middle part was you had a large number of people who were committed to various sorts of pretty far left ideologies. Not all of them communist in a pure sense. Some of them were neo-Marxist, some of them were kind of Rousseauian. But the game was up for them. They realized they didn't really have good arguments to combat the track record of what was going on in Canada, United States, Western Europe compared to Eastern Europe, Australia, Japan after it had modernized and become extraordinarily wealthy. So at that point, there's an interesting, I think, psychological question. When you believe a theory, and this is a problem we intellectuals have. It's not just political people, it's also religious people. If you really believe something to be true, you've got your ideology and you want it to be true, but nonetheless, you're a smart person and you're actually looking at some data and you're actually looking at history and you're actually looking at current events, and reality is just smacking you in the face that your theory is not working. What do you do?
Yeah.
Now, we know sometimes I think about a religious analogy here. We know sometimes people, when they are young, they will be raised very religiously and they will believe that their religion is true, that it's good, that it's beautiful, that it's noble. And that's the only theory they've learned, but it becomes part of their identity. I am the deeply religious person and I'm committed to that religion. But that person is smart. And then by the time they become a teenager, they start talking with other smart teenagers who believe different things. And they start reading all sorts of books. And they start coming up with arguments that they don't know how to answer those arguments. And they start looking at the results of their societies and religions, and it doesn't seem very good. So we do know about that crisis of religious faith that many smart people go through. This is not to say that religion is true or false. We're talking about if you believe your religion, but you don't think it can be rationally defended anymore, what do you do? And we do know that there's a fork in the road for people. Some people will say, I need to be a rational person. I have to go with the evidence. I have to go with the logic. And so what I need to do is I have to change my religion.
Mm.
Maybe I have to find a more rational religion. Maybe I should become an agnostic. Maybe I should even become an atheist because I'm going to follow where the logic and the evidence lead. And that's one kind of person. But we also know there's a psychology that will say, no matter what, I'm going to stick with my religious ideology. And they will find clever ways to attack evidence, to attack logic, to say that everything is just faith, everything is just belief, whatever you want, in order to protect their religious ideology. The same thing happens with political ideologies. In the middle part of the 20th century, there's a huge number of socialists. And when you read the socialist literature of the 1950s, the 1960s, it's very clear that they are in a crisis. They're saying, you know, Marx predicted that there was going to be the revolution, right? Rousseau had said this, that, and the other thing. But when we look at the data, it's kind of the exact opposite of what these guys said. But I still think socialism is this beautiful ideal. So what am I going to do? Now, some of them gave up on their socialist ideology. You know, they became middle of the road Democrats or Keynesians or free marketers or liberals of various sort. But we do know, and this is the historical record, some of them doubled down. They said, no matter what, I'm committed to socialism. I'm an ideologist. I'm an activist. We need just to find more clever strategies for attacking the damned capitalists, attacking the damned liberals, attacking this society that is being successful, but not for the reasons that I think so. So what you see is then they start to find other ways. We're not going to attack it economically like the Marxists say. It was kind of hard in the 60s and 70s and 80s to say capitalism is just making everybody poor. Because obviously in all of the capitalist nations, even the poor people are richer than all of the non-capitalist nations and so on. So they start to switch games. They start to say, well, the exploitation and the oppression, it's not so much about economics, it's about race, it's about sex, it's about the environment. And so the exact same anti-Western strategies then shift to other cultural domains. And I think that's where we are right now.
Yeah, I think one of the main problems we are facing, and I would like to hear your opinion on this, is we are sort of navigating an epistemological crisis in the sense that there seems to be this idea that it is impossible to know something like the truth, or that there is no truth.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this, reflected in different cultural products, for instance. Like now on the cover of magazines, you don't have these traditional beautiful women anymore. You have overweighted women. Then you don't know if you can say, that there are women, have uterus and they're, able to give birth to children. Now you cannot even say that that's a woman. You just say it's a birthing person or whatever. And this is everywhere. Like, for instance, in Chile, they are using this so-called inclusive language where you don't refer to boys and girls anymore. Mm-hmm. And all of that. It's like these realities don't exist. Let's pretend that this doesn't exist. So do you think that that's the way, if we go down that path, that's the way we lose the West?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. So the idea of truth as a regulative ideal, but also as something that we can, in fact, achieve. Sometimes the truth is very complicated and we have to work very hard and use very sophisticated scientific tools to do so. So this is where that anti-cognitive philosophy of the middle part of the 20th century has been extraordinarily influential. And right now, within philosophy, within cognitive science more broadly, that debate is being fought very vigorously, very harshly. And I think that ultimately is going to be where sort of, this is not too overheated language. The battle for the soul of civilization is being fought. When human beings have a big brain, where potentially we're very smart. And so if we believe that our brains can work effectively, and that we have to build up our minds and learn all kinds of good skills about processing evidence and doing scientific method and mathematics and so on, then we will do all of that work and we will continue to make progress. If we don't, if the skeptics win, then we will just say, well, what's the point of doing logic? What's the point of doing math? Instead, what many people will learn is, well, if it's all just subjective and nobody knows the truth, I might as well just do what I feel like. You know, whatever my identity is. If I want to be, you know, and then this is where all of the more crazy stuff is, then why can't I do that, right? And then it just becomes a social power struggle over who's got the loudest voice and who can make people do whatever it is that they want. So, you know, if now I think sex and gender is more complicated than what I'm seeing in the public press, but ultimately there is a biological fact of the matter there, and ultimately there are biological and psychological development facts of the matter. We are human beings that needs to be sorted out. And I do think in a lot of that, we are still in the early stages of that. But that's one thing to say. This is a complicated area of biology and psychology that we need to work it out. And there is a truth of the matter. And science is the right set of tools to help us figure out what the truth of the matter is, versus we're just going to be subjectivist and let anybody say or do whatever they want. And that then is going to have implications for legal structure and so forth. That would be a recipe for disaster.
So, you know, a central actor in all of this debate are universities, because, well, you know, they form the elites, the people who are supposed to lead society in the different spheres, you know, in the economic sphere, in the media sphere, and so on and so forth. And some people think that universities are completely lost. For instance, Neil Ferguson and others. I think Jordan Peterson is also more on that camp, like many of the very important and influential universities in the West, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, you know, have been taken over by these relativistic, I would even say totalitarian ideology, because I think relativism is a huge component of totalitarianism. But do you think that we can get universities back, like we can win this, or should we create new institutions like University of Texas Austin, for instance, and other initiatives that are being developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, I'm less pessimistic about universities than someone like Jordan Peterson is, or Neil Ferguson. I think it's a very mixed bag. I think many universities are overall healthy. That if you go into the science programs, many of the professional programs, even many of the social sciences, things are strong and there is great and beautiful work that is being done. That most of the damage and most of the sick and unhealthy areas of the university are more in my areas, in the humanities.
Yeah.
Although they are making some significant inroads, and they have done so in the last generation. So what I would say is, I think it's early days yet. Things move slowly in the academic world. And what I would say is this: liberalism thought it had won in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think what happened for about 20 years was a great deal of complacency. We won. We defeated the Nazis in the previous generation. Then we beat the communists in the next generation. Some sort of liberal capitalism is just going to be the way the future goes. And so we let our guard down, and people just started doing work in whatever their academic areas of specialty are: history, psychology, right, science, and so on. But there was this counter reaction of the skeptics, the relativists, and the ideological socialist communists who repackaged themselves, and they got more clever. And then for about 15 or 20 years, they were inside universities able to rework a lot of the committees and the governance processes that were going on in the universe. Because most people, if you're a university professor, you don't want to be on committees. You're not interested in governance. You want to just do your work, and don't ask me to be on committees. So they were very clever at taking over key committees and spreading the ideology within the university. And so that's why I think deservedly there is a perception that many universities have some very serious problems. And I do think that that is true. Now, where I am less pessimistic is that I want to say, starting about 7 years ago, I think around 2015, suddenly a lot of people inside the universities and in the general public became aware that there was a problem inside the universities. It's almost exactly 2015. Suddenly we start having inside the universities, hey, what's going on? Why do we have the beginnings of cancel culture and wokeism? And why do I have to go to these mandatory diversity meetings? And why do we have explicit racial quotas now being forced upon us by the provost or this particular committee? So suddenly people realize that they have a problem. Now, I put the dates to it as 2015 because that's precisely when someone like Jonathan Haidt, and then at the same time, approximately Jordan Peterson, and someone like Steven Pinker, and a few others start to say at their universities, and these are very smart guys, say, we have a problem inside the universities. They start to then say, I can't just do my work, I need also to start paying attention to what's going on inside my university. And then we start to see the beginnings of associations outside of particular universities, the networking that happens. People start to reach out as public intellectuals, Steven Pinker, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt, saying to the general public, there's something wrong inside the universities. You need to know about this. Let's work to solve the problem. Now, all of that's about 6.5 years or so ago, but it's a very encouraging sign because now most people inside the university recognize that there's a problem, that they can't just ignore it, and they are starting to do something about it. And then at the same time, we've got huge numbers of people outside of the universities, the politicians in many cases who are doing the funding, parents who are sending their children to the schools, donors who are writing checks. Everybody is focusing on the university. So now we're in the middle of the fight about what's going to happen inside the universities. Now, I think several universities will reform themselves. I think the best universities will reform themselves. We'll have a big argument. It will get ugly. There will be committee battles. People will hate each other, all of those rivalries. So all of that nasty politicking is going to happen in the universities. But I'm enough of an optimist to say I think the voices of reason and decency will prevail. I think also you mentioned the University of Austin, Ralston College. There's all kinds of other new entrepreneurial initiatives that are going to start. Some people will say, let's not reform. We've got a lot of money kicking around available for education. So there's going to be a lot of people who are education entrepreneurs who will say, well, let's just build a new one. Right? Plus, we have all of the technical tools and we have all of the online stuff. So I think we're actually, the more I'm talking now, the more optimistic I'm feeling. I think we're going to have a huge wave of entrepreneurism in the education space, including the higher education space, over the next 10 years. Now, 90% of those entrepreneurial ventures will fail. That's the way entrepreneurship goes. But then we'll have 10% of them will be great. They will be very successful. And at the same time, I do think the best universities will reform themselves. I don't think the people who end up at Harvard, who end up at Oxford and Stanford and so on are really going to commit suicide. I think they will let the debates happen. They will listen respectfully to the voice even of the relativists and the skeptics and the outright ideologues, but I think the better arguments will win and the reform will happen.
Well, I hope so, but thanks, you see, for example, in the United States, many universities are not even asking for the admission tests anymore, like the SLT and
Sure.
It's like you have like this war against excellency and
no, absolutely,
right?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that different in Canada? I mean, you think that there are differences with regard to what's going on in the United States in the sense of a stronger reaction against this woke culture than you can see in the UK or in Canada, for example?
Yeah, I think there are some variations. I think I would need better data about Canada, UK, Australia, United States, in order to make those fine-grained comparisons, because one of the way these battles occur is that there's 50 different issues, and each country is stronger and weaker on each of those issues. So in some way, Canada is better than the US, the UK is better than Australia, and so on. But in one sense, I also want to say we always have to remember that universities themselves are a liberal institution, the way we've done it in the modern world. We expect them to be very experimental. And when you have an experimental place and you give them lots of money and lots of freedom, lots of crazy stuff is going to happen. And so in one sense, a lot of these wokest ideas are part of the crazy experimenting that goes on inside universities. But also within universities, we do have pretty good resources to be able to evaluate how those experiments are going. So, to take your example, and it is in some ways a disturbing example, if we are not going to accept standardized tests anymore, if you've got some legitimate beefs with particular standardized tests, then you reform them. But if it really is, I just hate the idea of excellence and I want to destroy standards of excellence, and that's why I'm against standardized tests. Okay, so there are, say, I'm just making this number up, 1,000 colleges and universities in the United States, maybe 50 of them, that will be 5%, will get rid of their standardized tests. That will be an experiment. They will try it out for 3, 4, 5 years, and they will see, after the end of 4 or 5 years, are we now the kind of college or university that we want to be? Have we just admitted a huge number of uneducable students, right? Or did it work or not? And I think if it doesn't work, then even inside those universities, they will say, this is not working. We actually want to be an institution of higher education. We need to find some way of screening students, and they will then maybe reinstitute new and better tests by whatever their judgments are. So I might disagree with the rationales for the experiment, but I'm fine with the ongoing experimentalism because I think it's going to be self-correcting.
Well, I hope so. My fear is that because this is promoted for ideological reasons, and many of the administrators most of them, over 90%, are very, identitarian type of left-wing people. And then you have lots of professors who are also buying into this identitarian ideology. I think it will be very hard to change for the reasons that you were explaining earlier on. They double down.
I agree. I don't think it will be easy. I think it will be hard. I think a lot of universities, a significant number rather, will commit suicide, right, in just that way. But what that will mean is if they abandon standards and they continue down the we are against standards all of the way, well, they're not going to attract any quality students in 5 years. They're not going to attract any quality professors in 5 years. And then they're going to be a third-rate or fourth-rate college or university in 10 years, and they will just be out of business. So,
do you see also, this is one of the final questions, but do you see also people like Elon Musk as, leaders concerned with the fate of the West, and that he's trying to do something about it? Like, for instance, his whole Twitter affair, the whole thing of buying or not buying Twitter, and he claimed that this was crucial for the West to have the public square or the public sphere, as a place to have a rational debate on ideas. Do you see him and other people like him, maybe Peter Thiel and others, who are willing to take a stand and to even expose themselves to the rage of these mobs on social media and even the media?
No, I think what Elon Musk is doing on that issue is great. I think Peter Thiel's experiment, where he has his venture capital fund for university students and say, drop out of college, and if you've got a good business plan, we will fund it, and so on. So don't waste your time in higher education if you're not actually going to advance your career. I think all of those experiments are great. I think exactly what Elon Musk is doing with his principle, it's going to be a free speech platform as much as possible. That's very inspiring, and Twitter is one of the big platforms. I do the same thing. I want to say that we are in the early stages of social media. This is the first generation where we've got all of these big platforms. A lot of the big platforms are going to mess it up. They're going to make lots of mistakes. They will have the clunky algorithms. They will have some employees who are behind the scenes, ideologues, and manipulating the algorithms and so on. So I think also, though, that we are smart, and those of us who are the consumers of these platforms, we will recognize the problem, and then new platforms will be built. The next generation of them will come along, and I think also there will be some self-correction in the platforms. So I do think, though, that someone like Musk is a great hero for being a person who's willing to take the heat, as you are putting it, and also to put his money where his mouth is to actually build the ideal kind of liberal social media platform. So power to him.
Yeah, I agree with you. And finally, you come a lot to Latin America. You have been coming for many years, many times Argentina and other places. So what's your impression over time, about the region and you coming from, the West, developed world, United States, Canada, and you come here and you see, and then you go out. So you have any faith?
I love it. I love it. I've been through much of southern Brazil, a few times to Chile, many times to Argentina, Panama, Mexico, and so on. So it's a fascinating region. As you mentioned, since I've been there quite a few times, and my books have been translated into Brazilian and Spanish, I've been able to have a lot of intellectual friends and conversations. So I'm very impressed with the quality of the intellectuals that I meet and the students who reach out. One of the amazing things is, this will tie into the negative thing, is a large number of Latin American students in university are getting terrible educations at your universities. But the motivated and ambitious young Latin American students have access to the internet. And so they're going on and they're getting a self-education, and they are finding the smart people who know stuff that they want, and they're reaching out and they're getting a good self-education. So I'm very impressed with the ones who are more philosophically inclined and who reach out to me. They discover my books, or somehow they find their way to me. So so I'm impressed. I do think that, and this is a generalization, Latin American intellectual culture is overall bad, right? I think Latin American political culture is bad, and that's a problem, but the deeper problem is Latin American intellectual culture. And the problem is, sorry?
What do you mean when you say Latin American intellect? I agree with you, but
yes. What I mean is, and this is again an overgeneralization, right? The mainstream professors, and I've run into enough of them, right? Or the mainstream highly educated people who are the major columnists and talking heads about various sorts of issues. So unfortunately, philosophically, they have bought into an adversarial, victim-oriented view of the world. And as a result of the philosophy that they have bought into, when they put it into practice, it leads to terrible results. But rather than owning those results and say, this is our ideology that we're practicing, it leads to terrible results, therefore we need to change our ideology, they do have a self-sealed view of their ideology. Their ideology is correct. And if things are going badly in South America, it's somebody else's fault. Right? And so it's the gringos, right? Or it's the devil Americans, or the Canadians, the Europeans who are coming in and doing bad things for us. So I'm afraid my view is most Latin American intellectuals are intelligent, but they only get a partial education. They don't get a full philosophical liberal arts education, as I understand it. And unfortunately, the part that they get is mostly from the self-destructive part of the ideological spectrum. So I'm not impressed. I know there are lots of exceptions, but overall, I think that's the main problem. And of course, you point to the problem of the politicians. I mean, if you look at all of the indexes, Latin American, corruption indexes and so on, it's a sad story. But the politicians are typically educated people enough. They go to university, they go to law school or whatever. This is what they learn, and they just do business as usual when they become politicians. They're more a symptom of the problem than the cause of the problem. The cause is the intellectuals.
I fully agree with you, and that's why we created, for instance, Foundation for Progress in Chile, because no one in Chile is taught about the ideas of classical liberal thinkers, or let alone people like Mises or Hayek or Ayn Rand or whomever you want. I mean, they have no idea, zero clue.
Well, that's what I would say. I mean, if you are an intellectual in the humanities or in the social sciences, and you do not know John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith intimately at a very high level of proficiency, I'm sorry, you are an ignorant person. You should not have a PhD. You should not be a professor. You don't have to agree with them. You have to know these people.
Yeah, they don't. And actually, I went to one of the leading law schools in Chile. Yeah. And all the things I learned were, John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, people like that, social democrats, and of course some Marx, and nothing about classical liberals. I think maybe Locke briefly, that was it. But then, of course, a lot of Kant, and that wasn't so bad. But in the end, I fully agree with you, and it has been tough for me as a public intellectual in Latin America to spread these ideas. I think I'm crazy because I try to say that markets are positive for the country, and that Friedman was right on many things, and Hayek, and they haven't even read them. And the worst part is even the conservative right, on their intellectuals who are more on the center right, they attack you because you are evil for not thinking that we should have solidarity in the community, and the state should run things because you're an individualistic and a selfish person. So it's very hard in Latin America too.
Well, more power to you. I know it's a hard battle.
No, thank you. And with your support in this region, I think we are going to make more progress. And on behalf of Libero, I would like to thank you, Stephen, for this very interesting conversation. And we hope and look forward to having you in Chile soon, and having activities as we used to do.
Yes, now that the pandemic has passed. All right, well, excellent. No, I appreciate the invitation. Great questions, and let's keep the conversation going.
Will do. Thank you very much, Stephen.
Okay.
El Libero, la realidad como no la habías visto.
Haz que estos contenidos lleguen más lejos haciéndote miembro de la red Libero.